boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, very recently, Boxing Scene ran a story that reads, Jake Paul to advise Amanda Serrano on career, says he is involved in negotiating for Katie Taylor fight, to which Amanda Serrano added, great story, but I don't have a promoter anymore. Myself and Dibella had a good 5 years together. We are still good friends, and there are no hard feelings. But at this point in my career, a promoter isn't needed. I'm excited to be part of Jake Paul and his management team moving forward. It seems that Amanda Serrano has effectively cut out the middleman, because at this point in her career, that's what Dibella would be. If she is in fact being managed by Jake Paul's MVP management,
And she's going to be fighting on his undercards.
remember, Jake Paul's got a multi-fight deal with Showtime. And if Amanda Serrano's being allowed to tag along for the ride, she doesn't actually need a promoter.
That would just be one more person to have to pay at this point.
We don't always know what the future holds, the far-off future, but as far as the immediate future, if Amanda's fights are going to be taking place on Jake Paul's undercards, she doesn't need a promoter for that.
Not right now.
What you normally see is a fighter entering into a deal with a promoter to participate on that promoter's shows, that promoter's cards. The promoter is invested in the fighter.
And the promoter gives the fighter a platform to fight on.
That is, more or less, the dynamic. But if Amanda Serrano has found a platform to fight on by way of Jake Paul in that relationship, then there's no need for her.
Then she don't need a promoter.
Not right now, not for the time being, not in the immediate future, as all that would be is one more person I have to pay. One more hand in the cookie jar.
She says she's got some great news coming soon.
And I don't think it's in reference to a Katie Taylor fight. I don't. I think it might be in reference to a potential unification match before this year is out, which could take place on the undercard of Jake Paul's next fight. Last we heard, they were in the process of negotiating the Tommy Fury fight.
There was some blurb about Masvidal.
Jorge Masvidal. Jake Paul was calling him out on Twitter.
But I think Jorge's still under contract with the UFC.
And if he is, he's not at liberty to accept any offers for a crossover fight with Jake Paul to take place on Showtime. Not if he's still under contract with the UFC and Dana White.
Doesn't look like Jorge's going to be fighting Jake next.
So maybe it'll be Tommy Fury, who they did say they were negotiating with. Maybe it will be someone else. Though it's clear that
They're in the process of orchestrating Jake's next fight.
and if they're doing that, then they may also be in the process of orchestrating Amanda's next fight. Amanda, who we all know, wants to unify the featherweight division and become its undisputed champion. I told you, I don't think the Katie Taylor fight is next. I don't think that fight happens this year. What happens this year, what could happen before this year is out, is we see Amanda take on one of those champions at 126 pounds. Maybe Sarah Mahfoud, the reigning IBF champion, or Erica Cruz, the reigning WBA champion, newly crowned. Was news that she was offered the fight already, something to the tune of $100,000, and she didn't take the money. Maybe she'll come around.
And maybe that's what the news is.
Amanda Serrano parting ways with Dibella, not having a promoter, allows her as a fighter to see more of her own money, because that's one less hand in the cookie jar, one less middleman.
Because if he's not orchestrating your
fights aren't happening on his cards per se, then you really don't need him at this point. Though that's not saying that Dibella doesn't deserve his credit for what he's done with Amanda. He actually does. He's gotten her this far.
And that bridge isn't burned.
Things still seem amicable between them. Perhaps once Amanda's partnership with Jake Paul ends, you never know, she might re-sign with Dibella.
We'll just have to wait and see what news develops.
In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, an update to a story we talked about in a previous video, Jaime Munguia is set to fight Gabriel Rosado in October, and then, if he wins, face Sergey Derevyanchenko in a WBC final eliminator to determine Jermall Charlo's next mandatory. WBC President Mauricio Suleiman has confirmed.
So he is on the WBC route.
Looks that way. Jaime Munguia is the number one contender by way of both the WBC and the WBO, but we don't see any interest expressed from the Jaime Munguia people to lock horns with Demetrius Andrade, even though they fight on the same platform. It is what it is.
They're fighting Rosado next.
That's supposed to go down in October. That comes as a surprise to no one. I told you, I think he's going to fight Gabe next, and that's what he's doing.
And then Sergey afterwards.
That's a nice little sequence of fights, though I maintain my original sentiments when it comes to a Sergey Derevyanchenko fight. Sergey's in a bad way. He ain't rebounded off the loss to Jermall Charlo yet, and before that, he hadn't rebounded off the loss to Gennady Golovkin yet. He didn't have that in-between fight, that tune-up fight, that keep busy fight to get yourself back in the winner's bracket. He went from one really tough physical fight to another tough physical fight. And, if he don't squeeze in a fight between the Charlo fight and what could be the Munguia fight.
What do you think's going to happen?
The way it breaks down, he fought Gennady Golovkin in that war, and he sat out for a year. He then fights Jermall Charlo, loses that fight, sits out for another year, because in case you're not aware, it's been a year since Sergey fought Jermall Charlo.
That was in September of last year.
We're in September now.
Oh,
Time flies when you're having fun.
That's what they say.
Barring any unforeseen circumstances, any hiccups, anything upsetting the apple cart, if they get the Gabriel Rosado fight over the line and Jaime wins that fight, which I think he will, I think he can, he moves into a Sergey Derevyanchenko fight. And that could take place later on this year. Maybe they can squeeze it in, maybe they can't, maybe they do the fight early next year.
That's more likely.
They have that WBC final eliminator between Jaime and Sergey early next year, and they do what they've got to do. That does essentially mean that Jaime's on the WBC route. He means to challenge for the green belt, the WBC title that Jermall Charlo is in possession of.
Which is a whole nother set of issues entirely.
Jaime is a Zanfer Promotions / Golden Boy Promotions fighter that so far has been fighting on his own, whereas Jermall Charlo, we all know, he's on the PBC, and he fights on PBC-affiliated networks. Sometimes it's Fox, sometimes it's Showtime.
That fight could do good business in Texas.
I'll go as far as saying that it might do decent numbers on pay-per-view. It might, because of the Chicano contingent, those Mexican-American fans. Though there are political boundary lines there to be addressed, I don't know how committed Golden Boy and Zanfer are to that situation, are to that fight, but we'll see. We'll let time tell the story. And essentially what this means is that if Jaime is going the WBC route, he's not going the WBO route. And that allows Yanibek Halim Kanuli, who we also talked about in a previous video, to come center stage. If Jaime's stepping up, he's going another route. Jaime's number one by way of the WBC, but he's also number one by way of the WBO. We know he's going a WBC route. But by way of the WBO, guess who's ranked behind him? Guess who's the number 2 guy in the WBO's ranked standings? Yanibek Halim Kanuli. Ranked behind Yanibek is Esquiva Falcao of Brazil. Both of those guys, they fight under the top-ranked banner.
Bob's always had a way with the WBO.
And maybe what Bob can do is pull some strings with Paco Vercel, to see about staging a final eliminator between them, between Yanibek and Esquiva Falcao, to crown Demetrius Andrade's next mandatory challenger, since he doesn't have one due and won't have one due
till next year.
Per tweet from the WBO's president, Paco Vercel himself, Andrade's last mandatory was against Liam Williams, April 17th, 2021. His next mandatory will be due January 17th, 2022, 9 months since the Williams title bout. That affords the WBO enough time to order a fight between Yanibek and Esquiva Falcao, or whoever the next highest ranked contender is, whoever's willing and whoever's able to lock horns in order to be installed as Demetrius Andrade's mandatory challenger. Demetrius, he's supposed to be getting out there one more time before this year is out.
Yanibek is hot on his trail.
And at some point, he may have to deal with him. We'll see what happens. In other news, Peter Kahn has resigned as chief boxing officer at Triller.
I wonder why.
This news is coming on the heels of what was supposed to be the Oscar De La Hoya versus Victor Belfort pay-per-view, what became the Evander Holyfield versus Victor Belfort pay-per-view, the embarrassment. Question of the article reads, Kavanaugh Triller Boxing Club Chief Operating Officer Thorsten Mayer, who joined the company in July, will now be the primary principals tasked with studying the platform's future in combat sports.
And that's not all.
The freelance PR firm that was working with Triller, EAG, they have since severed ties to Triller on the heels of this Holyfield-Belfort pay-per-view. On the face of it, you might think that these are growing pains, except Triller's buzz, their involvement in the world of boxing, it isn't actually growing.
It's not.
They're not ironing out the kinks. They're coming apart at the seams. Triller, as it were, is beginning to unravel. That's my take on all of this, my interpretation of it. Triller doesn't actually have a full-fledged stable of fighters to really make a dent in the sport of boxing. How many boxing fans do you really think want to see a 58-year-old going on 59 years old Evander Holyfield tripping over his feet?
As a pay-per-view.
I mean, you don't have Jake Paul on board anymore to help you sell your little influencer circus freak fights. All you got are a bunch of old guys, bunch of retirees,
And Michael Hunter.
this stuff's supposed to be pay-per-view worthy. I told you guys weeks ago, before there was trouble in paradise, that Triller's stay in the sport of boxing might not be very long. They give me Rock Nation vibes.
I don't know where the revenue stream comes from.
We've seen some very heavy hitters, some familiar faces. I mean, now we've seen a former president participate on a Triller card. So they do have some means, but as far as their stay in the sport of boxing, emphasis on boxing, I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know what Triller's going to become. I just know that it looks like a lot of people are jumping ship.
I told you there's something fishy about those people.
I still can't wrap my mind around how it is they're paying for all of this. We've seen anyone from Snoop Dogg to Doja Cat to a former president, Donald Trump. I mean,
Where exactly does their revenue stream come from?
we know that Golden Boy Promotions platform deal with DAZN, it's supposed to be up this year, and it's widely speculated that they might jump into bed with Triller. I mean, remember, the initial plan was for Oscar De La Hoya to have his big comeback fight on that platform, as opposed to DAZN. Though, looking at how all of this is working out, Golden Boy Promotions, Roberto Diaz,
Eric Gomez, Oscar.
hope they reconsider. If they are looking at Triller as the potential home for Golden Boy Promotions fights, I hope they give it a second look. And I hope they make the decision to stay on DAZN as opposed to going to Triller, because Triller looks quite unstable right now.
There's something fishy going on over there.
And while I'm not sure what that is, if nothing else, Triller wants me and you, the boxing fans, to pay an additional $30 a month, roughly $300 a year for their cards, and I'm not seeing value for money in this. Even if Golden Boy Promotions were to cross over, it should cost you an additional $300 a month just to see Golden Boy, on top of what you're already paying.
Just to see their cards.
Now, as far as why Peter Khan stepped out on Triller and EAG, your guess is as good as mine. Unethical business practices, perhaps. Perhaps the writing is on the wall and they've read it.
They see this as a sinking ship.
Remember, Jim Lampley pulled out on Triller as well. He was supposed to be commentating on that Holyfield versus Belfort card.
You think it's because they invited Trump over?
No, I wouldn't rule that out, but this feels a little bit deeper than that. There's more going on here than meets the eye, and that...
Might be why everybody's jumping ship.
Finally, I'm sure most of you have heard by now, the news broke yesterday, that Dillian Whyte, in his next fight, he's not going to be fighting Jermaine Franklin, he's not going to be fighting Chris Arreola or Trevor Bryan, he's going to be fighting Otto Wallin. And I, like many of you, feel that this is a better fight than the aforementioned fights with the aforementioned fighters. Otto Wallin was an unheralded guy up until he found himself so confronted with Tyson Fury, who he gave a lot of problems. He proved to be a handful at that level, with one of the best heavyweights in the world of boxing here today.
I saw Otto Wallin in action before that.
Decent-sized fighter, young guy, can box a bit. I didn't know he had that in him.
I think he surprised a lot of people.
You know, one thing I really liked about that performance is that Otto Wallin showed he's got dog in him, pressuring Tyson Fury, muscling him around, gouging him, roughing him up. I mean, he forced Tyson Fury, who probably thought he was in for an easy night's work. He forced him to have to make alterations, hit another gear. Otto Wallin did that.
He actually thumbed the guy.
I like that. That shows he's willing to do what he's got to do to make it a rough night. He's got real fighting spirit. He boxed a bit more in his last fight. He won a unanimous decision against Dominic Breazeale over the course of 12 rounds. He didn't apply the pressure on Dominic that he applied on Tyson Fury. I do think he was a lot more inspired by that Tyson Fury fight, and he pulled out a career-best performance.
He rose to the occasion.
And on October 30th at the O2 Arena in London, he might rise to it yet again. He's back in the winner's bracket, coming off that win over Dominic Breazeale, and he's got a big-sized fight in front of him. I feel like this is a squandered opportunity for the PBC.
Otto's still an interesting guy.
They got fighters stuck out there with no dance partner. Fighters like Charles Martin.
That guy.
Fighters like Luis Ortiz.
That guy.
Otto Wallin versus any one of them would have been an interesting night. Interesting fight. As it turns out, Otto's going to be fighting Dillian instead, and I can't complain. I like the fight. I like it a lot more than a Franklin fight, than an Areola fight, surely, and than a Trevor Bryan fight. This is a better fight comparatively than those fights. A potential banana skin for Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte. He is a marquee guy over there in the United Kingdom. But Dillian Whyte versus Chris Areola, even across the pond, that don't move the needle. Dillian Whyte versus Trevor Bryan or Jermaine Franklin, maybe a little. Whereas Dillian Whyte versus Otto Wallin, who we all saw gave Tyson Fury all he could handle.
Now you're cooking with rice.
Sky Sports has made their big announcement that they're not leaving the world of boxing. They're in bed with Boxer. They're in bed with Wasserman. They've built a stable that I'm sure is going to grow over the next few weeks, over the next few months, that puts DAZN and Matchroom in a position to where they've got to make good fights in order to hold their position as the premier promotional outfit in the UK's boxing scene. They can't just throw any old body in there with Dillian Whyte. They need to throw somebody in there.
Somebody that people would want to see him fight.
For Whyte, this is an opportunity to outdo Tyson Fury, who we all know struggled. We all know he languished with Otto Wallin. This is a chance for Dillian to upstage him. If he can beat Otto Wallin in better fashion than Fury did, that sends a message to Fury now, don't it? And I know that triangle theories don't work.
Styles make fights.
It's more about the styles than anything else. The styles of the fighters, not their common opponents. But it still
sends a message.
And it still looks the way that it looks to the spectators in what is this spectator sport. Tyson Fury, you went life or death with this guy. So what happens if Dillian Whyte goes in there and he smokes him? He smokes him better than you.
Of course, you didn't smoke him.
You weathered him. You survived him. I wonder if Joey Gamache is going to be in Otto's corner for this fight, because if he is, we're in for a treat.
Joey helped Teofimo prepare for Loma.
Last I checked, he does train Otto Wallin as well.
You wanted value for money. This is value for money.